You don't expect it to happen to you, not after so many years together. But there I was, standing in my own kitchen, feeling like a stranger in my own life, wondering what on earth had changed. I don't know the exact moment it started, when I began to feel like something was off. It crept in slowly, like a shadow that stretched further each day, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. Linda and I had a life that ran like clockwork. I'm a farmer, and I've always found a rhythm in the work, in the seasons, in the quiet routines of our life. Nothing out of place. Or at least, that's what I thought. Linda was the kind of woman who brought energy wherever she went. She was always the one with a new idea, some fresh plan or project she'd throw herself into with everything she had. It's what drew me to her, that drive. I was the solid one, the steady hand in our relationship, and she'd always brought that spark. But lately, it was as if that spark was turned somewhere else. It started with small things, things that could almost be dismissed if you weren't paying attention. A different perfume, a new jacket, her way of slipping out in the evenings, sometimes gone for hours at a time, saying she needed a break or a night with her friend Karen. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd been together long enough that I figured she'd tell me if anything important was going on. But then there were the lies, disguised as half-truths. A casual mention of something big she was working on, something she couldn't talk about just yet. When I asked her what it was, she'd laugh it off, saying it was a surprise or that she'd explain it when the time was right. Except Linda was never one to keep secrets. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't meant to surprise me. It was meant to hide from me. There were the meetings with Karen, too, the kind that seemed to stretch on longer each time. Linda would come back from Karen's house late, distant, and sometimes, I swear, she'd come back looking almost guilty. I'd ask her about her night, try to strike up a normal conversation, but she'd wave me off, saying I was making a fuss over nothing. Still, the pattern kept repeating. She'd slip away, come back quieter, her mind somewhere else. One evening, I sat her down, calmly as I could, and told her I needed to know what was going on. I said I missed her, missed us, and wanted to understand where she was spending all her time. But instead of opening up, Linda looked at me with this almost cold expression. I'll never forget the way she brushed it off, saying I was acting paranoid, that I should stop hovering. She even called me old-fashioned, said I couldn't handle change. I was stunned, and for a second, I wondered if she was right. But deep down, I knew there was more to this, something she wasn't telling me. The house felt different, empty in a way it never had before. And that's when I knew I needed to get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. There's a certain comfort in routine, in the feeling that each month, each week, even each day brings the same rhythm. For me, that rhythm is my farm, the land I've put years into, and the satisfaction of knowing every corner of it. Every season, I plan, I work, and I trust that everything I plant will yield what I expect. It's why I'm so careful with our finances. Just like tending to the land, I've made it a habit to tend to our accounts, balancing every dollar, so we're always prepared for whatever comes our way. But that morning, as I went over the books, something felt wrong. Right there on the bank statement, tucked among the usual grocery receipts and small hardware store purchases, was a transaction that didn't fit. A hefty one labeled household expenses. I figured it must be a bulk order. Maybe Linda had stocked up on supplies for one of her projects, though she usually ran those things by me. I filed it away in my mind, thinking I'd ask her about it when she got home. But that wasn't all. As I kept going, I noticed another similar charge from the previous month, and another one before that. And these weren't small purchases either. These were several hundred, sometimes even $1,000, all marked under household expenses. My chest tightened as I looked at the statement in my hands. Linda was a practical woman, sure, but she wasn't one to spend big without reason, at least not from what I knew of her. Yet, here I was staring at numbers that didn't add up. By the time she came home that evening, my mind was spinning. I wanted to keep it casual, not to jump to conclusions. So, as we sat down for dinner, I brought it up gently, almost as an afterthought. I asked if she'd done any shopping recently, maybe for one of her projects, hinting that I'd noticed a few larger-than-usual expenses. For a moment, Linda paused, her fork hovering midair. It was just a fraction of a second, but I caught it, something in her expression that shifted like a shadow passing over her face. But then, just as quickly, she brushed it off, laughing lightly. "Oh, I've been investing in something new," she said, her tone dismissive, as if that was all the explanation I'd need. She even called it a special project, and promised that it would be worth it in the end. But her words left me with a hollow feeling. Linda had always been open with me, so why the mystery now? I wanted to press her, ask what exactly she meant by special project, but something in her eyes told me she'd brush off any question I threw her way. When I did ask for more details, her face hardened slightly. "It's a surprise," she said, and there was an edge to her tone. "I'll tell you about it when the time is right. You'll just have to trust me." Her words stung. Trust? Linda and I had built our life on trust, hadn't we? I didn't think I'd ever doubted her before, but the way she dismissed my questions so easily, like I was prying into something that was none of my business, well, that didn't sit right with me. I let it go that night, though I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Every marriage has its secrets, I told myself. Maybe this was just a phase, something that would pass. But the feeling gnawed at me. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying her words, that strange look in her eyes, the vague answers that went nowhere. The next weekend, Linda said she was heading out to meet her friend Karen again. She didn't offer many details, just threw on her coat, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and was out the door. Karen. That name had been coming up more and more lately. Linda had always been close with her, but recently, their visits had turned into weekly outings, sometimes even twice a week. Each time, Linda came back quieter, her face drawn, sometimes with an almost guilty look she tried to hide. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into things, but the tension in the house was building, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Once Linda was gone, I found myself alone with those bank statements again. I didn't mean to go snooping. In all the years we'd been together, I'd never felt the need to pry. But something was eating away at me, a nagging voice in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. I pulled out every recent statement I could find, laying them out on the kitchen table. I went through each line carefully, looking for anything that could explain the spending. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, but I knew I was lying to myself. The charges I found were worse than I'd expected. Restaurants with names I didn't recognize. Shops that sold luxury items we'd never buy. And then there were the hotels. Several bookings at high-end places in the city. Dates that lined up with weekends Linda had claimed to be busy or out with Karen. Each line on the statement felt like a slap, a reminder that something was happening right under my nose, and I'd been too blind to see it. I sat there, staring at those statements, a mix of anger and disbelief churning inside me. This wasn't just a one-time thing. No, this was a pattern, a trail of evidence leading straight to something Linda had been hiding. All her vague excuses, the late nights with Karen, the way she'd brushed off my questions. It was all starting to make sense, and the picture wasn't a pretty one. But I wasn't about to go charging in without more to go on. If there was one thing I'd learned from years of working the land, it was that patience always paid off. So I decided to wait, to watch, and to see just how far this would go. Because whatever was happening, I had a gut feeling this was only the beginning. The changes didn't stop. If anything, they became harder to ignore. Linda's outings with Karen, which started as the occasional girls' night, quickly turned into a regular event, almost like clockwork. I'd watch her throw on a new coat, fix her hair, and head out the door, sometimes barely saying a word to me. And each time, I'd tell myself to let it go. Maybe she just needed space, time away from the routines we'd built together. After all, we'd been married a long time. Everyone needs a break now and then. But there was a feeling I couldn't shake. It was the way she'd come back from these evenings with Karen. She'd slip into the house, her face flushed and a strange energy about her. Most nights, she'd say she was tired, avoiding eye contact, almost like she was hoping I wouldn't ask her anything at all. Other times, she'd greet me with a quick, distracted smile before heading straight to bed. Each of these moments chipped away at my trust, even though I tried to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. Then one night, Linda came home later than usual. It was past midnight, and I'd stayed up, telling myself I was just catching up on paperwork. But the truth was, I was waiting for her. I listened to her heels clicking across the floor as she entered, her coat draped over her arm, and I could see she was startled to find me still awake. She looked at me with a flash of guilt before quickly hiding it behind a casual smile. "Late night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, though I could feel the frustration simmering underneath. "Yeah, Karen had some things she wanted to talk through," she replied, her voice light, too light. She tried to breeze past me, but I wasn't done. "You see her a lot these days, don't you?" I said, folding my arms. "Seems like you're hardly around anymore." Linda paused, looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and something else. "Is this really about Karen? Or are you trying to accuse me of something?" She shot back, her tone defensive, almost defiant. It was the kind of response that didn't sit well with me. She'd never reacted this way before. "I'm just asking," I replied, keeping my voice calm. But the way she glared at me, like I was prying into something she thought was none of my business, made me clench my jaw. It wasn't the Linda I knew, not the one who used to come home and tell me about her day, the one who used to share everything with me. She brushed past me without another word, disappearing down the hall and leaving me standing there, feeling like I was a stranger in my own house. After she went to bed, I sat in the quiet of the kitchen, staring at the clock as it ticked away the hours. Her reaction didn't make sense. I wasn't accusing her of anything, yet she'd reacted as if I'd crossed some invisible line. And the worst part? That conversation left me feeling even further away from her, as if there was something between us I couldn't reach anymore. The next morning, Linda acted as though nothing had happened, going about her routine with a casual ease that only added to my frustration. She even asked if I wanted her to bring back coffee on her next trip out with Karen, as if that made up for her slipping away so often. I didn't answer, just nodded, biting back the urge to ask what had really happened last night. But I couldn't deny that it left a bitter taste, a nagging feeling that only deepened every time I watched her walk out the door. And it wasn't just the time with Karen. The spending continued, with more high-dollar charges showing up in our accounts. When I'd ask about them, Linda would brush them off as necessities or small investments. She'd smile as if I was simply overthinking it, tell me to trust her, that everything was under control. But those reassurances didn't hold water. I'd been married to Linda long enough to know her patterns, and what I was seeing now was a pattern I didn't recognize. I decided I needed more answers. If she wasn't going to be honest with me, then I'd have to find out on my own. After one of her late nights with Karen, I went to her closet and pulled out her purse. I don't know what I expected to find, but I searched it anyway, taking note of receipts for dinners at fancy restaurants and high-end boutiques. There was no reason for her to be hiding these from me, unless there was something else she wasn't telling me. And as I stood there, holding those receipts in my hands, something in me shifted. This wasn't just a series of misunderstandings or a harmless friendship with Karen. No, it was more than that, something Linda was keeping hidden. I put the receipts back and stepped away from her things, feeling the weight of each piece of paper, each dollar spent, as if it were building into something I couldn't ignore. After that, I started watching her more closely. Each time she went out, I'd make a mental note of how long she was gone, when she left, and when she came back. I'd ask casual questions, listen for any inconsistencies in her answers. And there were plenty. One night, she mentioned a new restaurant she and Karen had found, but the name didn't match any of the receipts I'd seen. Another time, she claimed she'd been shopping for supplies for our next project, yet I never saw a single thing come into the house. I kept my distance, biding my time, waiting to see just how far she'd take it. But each day that passed, each time she left with a vague excuse, added another crack to the life we'd built together. And I was starting to see that life for what it really was, something fragile, something that could shatter at any moment. So I kept gathering what little evidence I could, knowing that sooner or later, Linda would slip up. I knew I had to stay patient, let her keep believing she was getting away with it. Because once I had everything I needed, once I had proof of whatever was really going on, there'd be no turning back. And as much as it hurt, I knew there'd be no forgiveness either. A man can only live in suspicion for so long. There comes a point when you have to face the truth, even if it's something you'd rather not see. I'd spent weeks watching Linda slip away, spent nights lying awake wondering if I was going crazy, imagining all this. But the unanswered questions and that growing distance between us kept me on edge. And I couldn't ignore the pieces adding up, painting a picture I never wanted to believe. It was a few nights after her last girls' night with Karen that I decided enough was enough. Linda had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion from her busy day. I waited until her breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, then quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her. I went straight to the office where we kept our financial records, a place she rarely checked these days. I pulled out the bank statements, the recent credit card bills, anything I could get my hands on. As I pored over the numbers, each charge felt like a blow. There were dinners at upscale restaurants that charged more for one meal than we'd spend in a week. Hotel charges in the city that didn't line up with anything she'd ever mentioned. And then there were purchases from designer stores, places I knew Linda would never shop for our farm life. Fancy dresses, jewelry, high-end perfumes, items we'd never agreed to buy. A part of me still hoped there was an explanation, some reason that would make sense of all this. But with each line I read, the truth felt like a knife twisting deeper. Linda wasn't just spending money. She was using lines of credit, debts opened in my name, adding up to thousands that I'd be held accountable for. I was shocked to see just how much she'd hidden, as if I didn't exist in these decisions, as if she'd been leading a life I knew nothing about. What hit me hardest was realizing how easy it must have been for her. She knew I trusted her, knew I'd never think twice about our finances. I'd always been careful with money, treating every dollar as though it counted. But here was the woman I'd shared my life with, bleeding our accounts dry, one charge at a time. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a deep, calculated disregard for everything we'd built together. I sat there, surrounded by evidence, feeling like a fool. How had I missed this? I'd been so wrapped up in thinking she was just going through a phase, that maybe she needed space or was trying to find herself. But this was beyond anything I'd imagined. This was deception on a level that cut to the bone. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I picked up the final piece of paper, a recent credit card bill with a charge from a luxury hotel I'd never heard of. The date on the receipt was from one of those networking weekends she claimed to be at with Karen. My hands trembled as I read through it, each word blurring together in a mix of rage and heartbreak. Karen. It had all started with her, hadn't it? The late nights, the new projects, the distance that seemed to grow with every one of their outings. Part of me wondered if Karen was in on it, if she'd helped cover for Linda, let her play out this fantasy life while I stayed at home. None the wiser. The idea made my blood boil. If they were both in on this, hiding things from me, then I'd been living a lie with everyone around me. I knew I couldn't confront Linda yet. No, I needed more. Something solid that she couldn't talk her way out of. So I started gathering everything, the bank statements, the bills, the receipts for dinners and designer purchases. I made copies, stacked them neatly in a folder, creating my own file of evidence. Because when I confronted her, I wanted no room for excuses. I wanted her to see just how much I knew, to look her in the eye and let her try to explain her way out of this. The next morning, I was up before the sun, moving quietly around the house. Linda noticed I was quieter than usual, but if she suspected anything, she didn't show it. She left for the day, saying she had some errands to run. As soon as she was gone, I drove into town to meet with a lawyer, someone who could help me untangle the mess of debts Linda had woven in my name. Sitting in that lawyer's office, laying out everything I'd discovered, felt like confessing a shameful secret. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded as I explained the situation, his face a mask of professional calm. But I could see in his eyes that he understood. He knew what this was. He'd seen it all before. The deceit, the lies, the money siphoned away without a thought for what it would do to the one left behind. By the time I left his office, I'd taken the first steps to protect myself. The lawyer would help me separate my finances from Linda's, and we'd start working on a plan to prevent her from accessing anything tied to my farm. I'd be taking control of every account, every asset, locking her out completely. It was a step I never thought I'd have to take. But there I was, forced into it by the person I trusted most. And when Linda came home that evening, it was all I could do to keep a straight face, to act like I didn't know the truth. I watched her go about her usual routine, laughing and chatting like nothing had changed, like she hadn't torn apart everything we'd spent years building. Every word she said felt hollow, every smile a reminder of how easily she'd lied to me, right to my face. But the moment she went to bed, I knew that I couldn't keep up the charade forever. This wasn't something I could forgive or look past. She'd hidden debts in my name, siphoned our money, used my trust as her cover to build some other life. And whatever that life was, whatever she'd thought she'd find in it, I was done being the fool who let her take everything she wanted. I was ready to confront her, to demand answers. But this time, it wouldn't just be questions. This time, I'd be coming with every piece of evidence she'd try to hide. And when I was through, she'd have nowhere to run. It's funny, the clarity that comes when you finally decide to act. After weeks of watching Linda slip away, lying to my face with practiced ease, I was done waiting. The lawyer's words echoed in my head as I drove home that day. Protect yourself first, John. Let the rest sort itself out. By the time I got back to the house, I'd already made up my mind. If she wanted to live her life in secrets and lies, so be it. But she'd do it alone. The first thing I did was pull every dollar I could from our joint accounts. I didn't care if she noticed. Honestly, I hoped she would. I moved the funds to an account in my name alone, shutting her out entirely. Next, I canceled all the credit cards we shared. She'd have nothing to charge on my dime ever again. The idea of her spending my money on hotel stays and fancy dinners with who knows who made me sick, and if she thought she'd keep taking from me, she was in for a shock. After the accounts were squared away, I went to the files. I pulled out every document, every piece of paperwork tied to my name, and started redoing everything. The farm deeds, our insurance, the utilities, anything with my name on it. I went through line by line, making sure there wasn't a single loophole she could exploit. By the time I was done, every asset I cared about was legally separate, locked up tight. If she thought she'd walk away with even a shred of my family's land, she was dead wrong. Over the next few days, I started telling a few close friends about what I'd discovered. I didn't go into all the sordid details, just enough so they understood that Linda hadn't just broken my trust, she'd broken our entire life. I could see the shock in their eyes, the pity, but also the anger. They knew me well enough to know I'd never lie about something like this. And it wasn't long before word began to spread, weaving its way through our tight-knit community. It's amazing how fast rumors spread when there's something to talk about. I knew people would start looking at Linda differently, that friends who once welcomed her would turn colder, see her for what she really was. It wasn't about revenge. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But the thought of her facing the consequences, of her reputation falling apart just like our marriage, gave me a sense of satisfaction I couldn't deny. Then came Karen. She was the last piece of the puzzle, and I wasn't about to let her slip away from this. She'd covered for Linda, lied for her, helped her play this little game behind my back. The thought made my blood boil. I'd known Karen as long as I'd known Linda, trusted her, even liked her. Now, though, all I could see was someone who'd laughed at me, who'd encouraged Linda's lies, who'd kept her secret safe while I was kept in the dark. One evening, I invited Karen over. I didn't tell Linda. I wanted this conversation to be just between the two of us. When Karen arrived, she seemed her usual self, bright and cheerful, but I could tell something was off. Maybe she'd heard the rumors. Maybe she'd sensed Linda's tension, but her eyes held a hint of worry. I wasted no time. Karen, I began, pouring 2 cups of coffee. I need to know the truth. About Linda, about where she's been going, what she's been doing, and I know you know more than you've been letting on. Her face went pale, and she glanced away, the confidence slipping right off her face. John, Linda's just been, busy with her projects, she stammered, her eyes darting around the room. I leaned forward, my voice cold. I've seen the receipts, the bank statements, the hotel bills. I know what she's been doing, Karen. I know she hasn't been honest, and I know you've helped her hide it. I want you to stop lying and tell me the truth. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment, she just sat there, looking down at her coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. John, I didn't think it would go this far. I thought she was just trying to find herself. I didn't know she'd start. Her voice trailed off, and she swallowed, still unable to meet my gaze. "That's not good enough," I replied, my tone steady, unflinching. "You've helped her play this game, whatever it is. You've lied to me, covered for her, and let me believe everything was fine. That's over now. If you won't tell me what's been going on, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how involved you've been." Her eyes shot up, and I saw the fear there. She nodded, muttering a quick, "I'm sorry, John," before rushing out, not even bothering to finish her coffee. I knew she'd heard my message loud and clear. I didn't need her confession anymore. Her reaction was all the proof I needed. When Linda got home that night, I felt calmer, almost relieved. I'd taken back control. She might not know it yet, but her world was about to come crashing down, and I wasn't about to soften the blow. That night, I made one final preparation. I went to our room, opened her closet, and packed up a suitcase. Inside, I placed the folder of evidence I'd gathered, the bank statements, credit card bills, and the receipts from her nights out. I left it on her side of the bed, right where she'd see it. I wanted her to know that I'd seen everything, that there was no hiding anymore. I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't feel the usual restlessness either. It was a kind of stillness, a strange calm that comes when you know the worst is coming, but you're ready for it. When Linda came home from one of her outings the next evening, she found the suitcase waiting, along with every last piece of evidence. As she entered, I simply nodded toward the bed. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, final. And for the first time in months, I saw panic in her eyes. There's a strange kind of power in knowing the truth, in watching someone squirm as they realize they've been caught. Linda walked into the bedroom that night, expecting everything to go as usual. But when her eyes fell on the suitcase sitting on the bed, a flash of confusion crossed her face. And then she saw the stack of bank statements, receipts, and credit card bills. The color drained from her cheeks as she pieced it together, realizing exactly what she was looking at. I could see the wheels turning in her head, her mind racing as she tried to come up with some explanation, some excuse. She turned to me, forcing a weak smile, but her voice betrayed her. "John, what's all this?" she asked, trying to sound casual, like she hadn't just come face to face with every lie she'd told me over the past few months. "You tell me, Linda," I replied, keeping my voice calm and measured. "What's all this?" "The hotel stays, the designer clothes, the charges I never knew about." "Go ahead. I'd love to hear your explanation." For a moment, she just stood there, her mouth opening and closing, searching for words that wouldn't come. I could see her face crumbling as she realized there was no way out of this. Finally, she took a deep breath, steadying herself, and tried to gather the remnants of her composure. "John," she started, her voice soft, almost pleading. "It's not what you think. I was going through something. I needed space. I needed time to figure things out." "Figure things out?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us. "By spending our money on things you hid from me? On hotel rooms and clothes, and God knows what else? You needed space, so you decided to bleed me dry." Her face twisted in a mix of anger and desperation, as if she were the one who'd been wronged. "It's not like that," she said sharply. I needed something different, John. I needed a break from all this. From the farm, from everything. It was just a few nights away. Just something to clear my head." "Clear your head?" I echoed, my voice cold. "So that's what this was, just some personal retreat? Because you wanted to find yourself?" I shook my head, feeling the anger burn through me. "Linda, if you wanted space, you should have told me. Instead, you lied to me, used our money for a life I knew nothing about. I trusted you. I thought we were partners. And this is what you do with that trust." She flinched at my words, her eyes darting down to the folder. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, barely meeting my gaze. "I just needed to escape, John. I needed something for me." "For you," I replied, my voice rising. "You don't think I've sacrificed things for us? You don't think I've had moments where I felt trapped, or worn down, or needed a break? But I stayed. I worked through it because that's what marriage is supposed to be. But you." I stopped, shaking my head, struggling to find the words. She took a step toward me, her hands raised as if to placate me, her voice softening. John, please, let's not throw everything away over this. I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I know that now. But we can work through it. We can fix this. Just give me a chance to make it right. I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. Fix this? Make it right? Linda, you've spent months lying to me, draining our finances, keeping secrets, and you expect me to just forgive it all? Like it's nothing? Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy, not anymore. We can try, John. We can go to counseling, talk this through. I'll stop spending, I'll change. Just please, don't throw us away. But her words fell flat. All I could think about was the years I'd put into building a life with her. A life she'd tossed aside for her own selfish reasons. The sacrifices I'd made, the trust I'd placed in her, it was all for nothing. No, Linda, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm done. You made your choices. You had every opportunity to come clean, to talk to me, to work through whatever it was you were going through. But instead, you hid behind lies, used me, treated me like a fool. And now you want to save this marriage? It's too late. Her face fell, the reality of my words finally sinking in. So, what are you saying? She whispered, her voice trembling. I'm saying we're done. I replied, each word like a weight lifted from my chest. I've already started the process. The accounts are closed, the lawyer's been contacted, and soon enough, you'll be out of my life for good. She staggered back, a look of shock and betrayal crossing her face. You already went to a lawyer? She choked out. Of course I did, I replied, unflinching. I'm not giving you a chance to drag this out, to manipulate me further. Everything we own is in my name now. You'll leave here with nothing, just as you deserve. Her expression hardened, the pleading look replaced with one of cold fury. You can't do this, John. I have rights. I'm entitled to half of everything we've built together. I met her gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over me. You're not entitled to anything, Linda. The farm, the money, it's all in my name. You forfeited any right to it the moment you decided to lie to me, to treat our marriage like it was just some game. Her eyes narrowed, anger flashing across her face. You think you can just toss me aside like this? After everything we've been through? I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a quiet, cold tone. No, Linda. You tossed yourself aside. You made these choices, not me. And now you'll live with the consequences. I could see her struggling, her mind racing to find some way to salvage the situation. She took a shaky breath, her voice desperate. John, please. I don't want to lose you. Just give me one more chance. Let me show you I can be different. I'll give up everything, just to prove it to you. I held up my hand, cutting her off. No more lies, Linda. No more games. We're finished. For a long moment, we stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I watched as she took in the reality of it all, her face a mask of rage and defeat. Without another word, I turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the mess she'd created. As I walked away, I felt an unfamiliar sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders. The life I thought we had was gone, shattered by her betrayal. But at least now, I knew the truth. And I'd be damned if I let her take anything more from me. I wish I could say I felt better after that night, that seeing Linda face the reality of her actions gave me some kind of peace. But the truth is, the whole thing left me feeling hollow. That's what betrayal does, I suppose. It doesn't just hurt you. It strips away the person you thought you were, along with the life you thought you had. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings with my lawyer, and carefully closing every door Linda thought she'd left open. She fought me, of course. Despite everything she'd done, she still tried to lay claim to my land, to our assets, to everything I'd spent years building. Her lawyer made arguments about shared responsibilities and contributions, trying to paint her as an equal partner. But each time they tried, I pushed back harder, showing every receipt, every piece of evidence of what she'd done, how she'd bled us dry behind my back. It wasn't easy, but after what I discovered, I wasn't about to let her take anything more from me. Every meeting, every court appearance, every document I signed was a reminder of what she'd done. But it was also a reminder that I was taking back control of my life, piece by piece. And each time I won a small victory, an asset secured, an account closed, I felt lighter, as if the weight she'd left me with was finally starting to lift. Linda didn't take it well. I could see the bitterness in her eyes every time we were in the same room. At first, she tried to play the victim, talking about mistakes and second chances. She even went as far as writing letters to my family, to our friends, painting herself as someone who'd lost her way, someone worthy of forgiveness. But they knew the truth. By then, word of what she'd done had spread, and the sympathy she tried to pull from others quickly ran dry. There was one last confrontation, though, one final attempt she made to claw her way back in. It was the day of our last court meeting, the final hearing that would end it all, officially dissolving everything we'd built on paper. Linda found me alone in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to start. She walked up to me, her eyes red, her expression pleading. "John," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "This is it, isn't it? There's no going back." I didn't answer, just looked at her, waiting to hear what she had to say. She took a shaky breath, and for a moment, I thought I saw something real, a glimmer of the woman I once knew. But then she spoke again, and that illusion shattered. "All I wanted was a little excitement, something more," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought we'd both just move past it. I thought you'd understand that sometimes people make mistakes." I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed down the empty hallway. "Mistakes?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Linda, this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. One you made over and over again. Every time you lied, every time you spent our money on some fantasy. You made those choices, and now you'll live with them." She looked away, her face hardening, the sadness replaced with a flash of anger. "You think you're perfect, don't you, John? Always so righteous. Always so sure of yourself. Maybe if you weren't so wrapped up in your own world, I wouldn't have needed to find something outside of us." Her words stung, but I didn't let them show. I'd come too far to let her get to me now. I met her gaze, my expression steady, unflinching. "I gave you everything, Linda, everything I had, and if that wasn't enough for you, then I'm glad you found what you needed somewhere else. But don't you dare put this on me. You chose this path, and now it's yours to walk alone." With that, I turned away, leaving her standing there, her words hanging in the air like smoke. By the time I walked into that courtroom, I knew there was no turning back. And when it was over, when the judge signed the papers and officially severed the ties that had once bound us, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: freedom. In the days that followed, I began putting my life back together, one step at a time. The house felt emptier, but it also felt lighter, as if a storm had finally passed, leaving behind only calm. I poured myself into my work, into rebuilding what she'd tried to tear down. And each day, as I walked the fields and tended to the land, I felt myself returning, piece by piece, to the man I'd been before. My family and friends rallied around me, offering their support, their understanding. They didn't ask too many questions. They knew enough to realize that I was moving on, that the past was behind me. And little by little, I found myself letting go, forgiving myself for the blindness that had led me into her lies. I knew now that trust was something you had to earn, that love was only real when both people cherished it. There were still moments of bitterness, flashes of anger that would rise up when I least expected it. But each time, I reminded myself that I'd done what I needed to do, that I'd taken control of my life and my future. Linda might have thought she'd broken me, but in the end, she'd only made me stronger. Months passed, and the pain of her betrayal began to fade, replaced by something else, a sense of peace, of clarity. I was no longer haunted by questions or what-ifs. I had seen her true colors, and while it had hurt, it had also freed me. I was no longer bound to someone who didn't value the life we'd built, the promises we'd made. In the end, I found strength in the simplicity of my own life, in the rhythm of work and the loyalty of the people who stood by me. And as I moved forward, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone take advantage of me again. I'd learned my lesson, paid the price, and now I was free.